24 News Studios in Times Square in New York. This is Clear Cut with Michelle Makori.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper made news on a number of topics while visiting London today. But the biggest news was Esper's assessment of Iran's state of mind when it comes to making some possible new agreement with Western powers. He said that he believes Iran is inching closer to being willing to talk about making a new deal. But this still comes just as Iran formally announced today that it is removing virtually all of the restrictions that it agreed to for its nuclear program under the 2015 deal. That includes the enrichment of uranium to weapons-grade levels. And speaking of that issue, the acting head of the UN's International Atomic Energy Agency is now scheduled to meet with high-level Iranian officials over the weekend. But Secretary Esper didn't just have Iran on his mind today. He also had some harsh words for China and Russia. For more on that, let's bring in our senior Washington correspondent, Dan Raviv. All right, Dan, first, tell us about what he had to say about Russia.
Far more skeptical, Michelle, than what President Trump usually says. Let's watch.
Russia continues to disregard international rules and norms as it pursues veto authority over the economic, diplomatic, and security decisions of its neighbors and others. By violating the borders of nearby nations and meddling in foreign elections, Russia's malign influence seeks to undermine the integrity of the NATO alliance.
These were very strong statements. The Defense Secretary was speaking in London. He said the U.S. is expanding its military presence in Poland and also in Baltic countries that border Russia to build, as Esper put it, a more credible deterrence and fight and win if necessary. Tough stuff, describing Russia as a threat, Michelle.
And Danny also had some choice words regarding China, special warning about Beijing. Tell us about that.
Yes, at first he lumped together Russia and China. This almost sounded like the old Cold War. He said that they are trying to disrupt the international order, and he warned countries against opening themselves up to money, factories, mining, and other projects offered by China.
The more dependent a country becomes on Chinese investment and trade, the more susceptible they are to coercion and retribution when they act outside of Beijing's wishes. The political and economic leverage China is gaining by carrying out this strategy has begun eroding the sovereignty of many nations. Ultimately, this influence trickles down to the security arena and leads countries to make suboptimal defense decisions for fear of upsetting the Chinese Communist Party and being punished through economic measures or political backlash. Additionally, China's technology theft for military gain is staggering.
Just a reminder that Mark Esper was confirmed by the Senate as the defense secretary 6 weeks ago, and the vote was 90-8. Overall, you could say that Esper is proving himself to be someone who speaks very strongly, maybe more strongly than the president does, about military threats from Russia and China. But, you know, here in Washington, it's often said that the civilian who's in charge of the Defense Department, there at the Pentagon, that's his job to emphasize America's strength and also to warn about the might that America's foes might show. Michelle?
Dan, thanks so much for that update. Dan Raviv live for us in Washington, D.C. All right, let's focus on Esper's comments regarding Iran and Iran's nuclear moves with tonight's opening panel. Joining us is former U.S. Naval Intelligence Officer John Jordan. Also with us is Matt Brodsky, a senior fellow at the Security Studies Group. Good to have you both with us. John, let's start with you. We have Esper saying that Iran is inching closer to talks. Yesterday, Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu, after his meeting with Johnson, said that he doesn't rule out a meeting between the president and Iran's President Rouhani in the near future. He says he has full confidence in Trump's negotiation positions. What are you reading into this, John?
Well, first of all, I'm not entirely convinced that Iran is inching necessarily closer. I think we're closer to the point where Iran is going to be compelled to come to the table and offer serious concessions. But there's a lot of internal politics inside of Tehran, and ultimately Ayatollah Khamenei is going to have to rule on that. I'm not sure what Secretary Esper bases this on, but right now it looks, you know, I think we have a little more ways to go, a little more economic pain that the Iranians have to experience before we come to the table.
Matt, what's your read?
Well, my read is that what's going to be very important is early next week when the IAEA Board of Governors gets together. They're basically going to be discussing what came from Israel's intelligence when they took out the giant treasure trove of documents, the tons of information regarding Iran's previous military dimension of its nuclear program. The IAEA has dragged its feet on it. They issued a lukewarm type of report in July, and they've known about this for a while. We're at the point where the IAEA may very well say that that Iran is breaking its commitment to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it is, of course, a signatory of, which means it's not just breaking the nuclear agreement from 2015 and all this new actions, it's that it's been breaking its prior commitments from far beforehand, which would really put a dagger in the entire idea of the nuclear agreement, which should compel, hopefully, Europe to go along with the United States to realize that there's no deal here worth repairing. There has to be something brand new from the beginning, and therefore they should join in the maximum amount of pressure and consider going to the UN and reinstating the snapback sanctions.
But, John, how likely is it that even with fresh intelligence from the International Atomic Energy Agency that Iran has long been violating all sorts of commitments, that we will actually see any kind of shift in position from the Europeans?
Not at all. I mean, it's completely unlikely. Europeans have no interest in seriously curtailing Iran's activities.
Why not,
Europe's
John?
interests
Why
are purely
not?
mercantile. Iran's interests, Europe's interests are purely mercantile. You know, even with the 2015 JCPOA, there was no effort to constrain Iran's missile programs or to constrain Hezbollah. Europe wants to put together the JCPOA because their biggest economies are teetering on recession. Their trade with Iran has been cut by 80% since Trump reinstitutes the sanctions. It's about economics for Europe. They have no interest at all in actually curtailing the activities of the mullahs and Hezbollah and their various proxy groups in the Middle East.
All right. So, John, what happens next, very quickly?
What happens next, very quickly, is there will be a lot of show that, by the way, all of the Iran being in violation of the NPT is not new. The Europeans know this. They don't care. They're going to sit there and fiddle and try to stitch something together half-heartedly, maybe. And Iran's economy will continue to deteriorate. And then the Iranian leadership is going to have to make a choice, whether to come to the table or not. And if they don't, the economic situation in Iran is deteriorating so rapidly that their own regime is really in an existential crisis.
All right, thanks. We're out of time. John, thank you so much. John Jordan, Matt Brodsky, appreciate it as always. Over to Israel now. We're a more violent than usual Friday on the